US tells Israel its plans to send ground troops into Rafah in Gaza would be a mistake.
That we share the goal of defeating Hamas. We just believe you need a coherent and sustainable strategy to make that happen.
The US warships trying to stop Houthi attacks on merchant ships passing through the Red Sea.
It's difficult to define winning and losing in this kind of conflict. Our goal is to restore freedom of navigation, that's all.
A major upgrade for the technology powering much of the boom in artificial intelligence, and possibly the most famous pair of ruby slippers are going on a world tour ahead of being sold at auction.
Hello, I'm Neil Nunes with the BBC News. Japan's central bank has ended its policy of negative interest rates and raised the cost of borrowing for the first time in 17 years. This means there are no countries left in the world with negative interest rates. More details now from Mariko Oi.
Japan was a pioneer in cutting interest rates to zero at the end of the last century to stimulate the economy. And in 2016, it went further by cutting them to below zero. But for the first time in 17 years, the country's central bank has increased the cost of borrowing to 0 to 0.1%. The move comes as salaries have finally started to increase after being flat for decades. That's because Japan had little to no inflation since the 90s, and it even suffered from deflation when prices fell. But for the last few years, the country has seen higher food and fuel prices, driven largely by the pandemic and the war in Ukraine.
The former US President Donald Trump has reacted angrily to his failure to secure the close to $500 million bond that he needs to appeal against the judgment in his civil fraud case in New York. His lawyers say sureties of that magnitude are almost unprecedented for an individual or a private company. Edda Tawfik has more now from New York.
A bond company takes on the responsibility for any payout if a defendant loses on appeal and is unable to pay. According to Donald Trump's lawyers, obtaining a bond has proven to be a practical impossibility after approaching roughly 30 such companies. Mr. Trump had previously asked the court to be allowed to post a $100 million bond, but that was rejected. If he is not granted a pause and truly does not have the cash, then the Attorney General Letitia James could potentially ask the judge to start seizing his assets.
Neda Tawfik reporting. President Biden has spoken to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for the first time in a month to repeat his warning that a military operation in Rafah in southern Gaza would be a mistake. More than 1 million people have fled to the city. This report from our North America correspondent, Peter Rose.
President Biden, during his call with Benjamin Netanyahu, explained why he was deeply concerned about the prospect of Israel conducting major military operations in Rafah. He said it would lead to more innocent civilian deaths, worsen the already dire humanitarian crisis, and further isolate Israel internationally. Recent weeks have seen a widening rift in US-Israel relations, which intensified after the Democratic leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, called for a new Israeli government and described Mr. Netanyahu as an obstacle to peace.
This is the latest world news from the BBC. The United States says it's destroyed 7 anti-ship missiles, 3 drones and 3 weapon storage containers in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen on Monday. U.S. Central Command said the weapons presented an imminent threat. An officer in command of 4 U.S. Navy destroyers said the mission to the Red Sea region and the area nearby was experiencing the greatest number of attacks since the Second World War. The Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado has told the BBC that Latin America should prepare for the biggest wave of mass migration yet if President Nicolás Maduro is re-elected later this year. Ms. Machado had been disqualified from running in July's presidential election following financial misconduct allegations, which she denies.
It's obvious Maduro fears the possibility of competing against me because he knows he would have a landslide defeat. And he's trying to block because it is the first time in 25 years we are have a Chavista regime, in which we face a presidential election with more than 80% of support. So they have said clearly that they will not let me run.
The United Nations Secretary General has expressed concern over the deteriorating security situation in Myanmar and reiterated his call for the cessation of hostilities and improved humanitarian access. A spokesman for Antonio Guterres said he was particularly alarmed by reports that military airstrikes on a village in Rakhine State on Monday had killed and injured many civilians. Flooding and landslides caused by torrential rains in Papua New Guinea have left at least 20 people dead. Homes have been damaged and roads washed away in the central highlands region. The National Disaster Centre said people had been buried under 3 separate mudslides.
Hello, this is Alex Ritson with the newsroom. For a man who rose to power on a wave of wealth and performative glitz, Donald Trump has had a rather chastening Monday. His lawyers have told a court in New York that he can't raise a bond of almost $500 million. He needs to appeal against a judgment in a civil fraud case. The court had found he'd exaggerated his wealth to obtain loans at a more favourable rate. If he doesn't pay up by next week, New York State Court could start seizing his properties, which is not a good look for a real estate tycoon. And a judge in another case, in which he's accused of paying hush money to a porn actress, has refused his request to ban her and his former lawyer from giving evidence. I asked Peter Bowes in Los Angeles what the significance was of Mr. Trump's lawyers saying he couldn't put up the money.
I think the most significant repercussion from this could be that, as you've mentioned, some of Donald Trump's properties will be liquidated, sold off at an auction to cover the $464 million, which is accruing this vast amount of interest, $100,000 a day. The downside of that for the former president is that a quick sale, because he needs the cash, isn't likely to result in him getting the best prices for his buildings, but it appears to be the only option. And if he doesn't either pay the full amount or manage to find a bonding company to cover it, well, that seems to be what is going to happen. His lawyers say it's a practical impossibility and insurmountable difficulty getting a bond company to agree.
There's a certain irony, though, isn't there, that a man who denied accusations of exaggerating his wealth now says that he can't come up with the cash.
Well, he testified last year that he had $400 million in liquid assets. In fact, in the last few hours, he's issued a statement about this, and he described a bond of the size set as unprecedented and practically impossible for any bonding company to post. But it is certainly a very difficult situation that the former president is in.
Is this going to affect the upcoming presidential election?
Election laws here prohibit the use of campaign funds for personal use. So there is a dividing line between what is being spent on campaigning for the election and the funds that are needed to meet this court judgment. But just in terms of pure bad press, out of all of this, it's maybe more likely that a verdict in one or more of the criminal cases, if they go against the former president, that they would affect the election.
There's been some pre-trial manoeuvring in the Stormy Daniels hush money case too, hasn't there? Where are we on this?
This is the case in which he's accused of falsifying business records to cover up the reimbursement of his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, for the payment to Stormy Daniels. Well, we've learned that Donald Trump has lost a bid to block Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels from giving evidence. He'd argued that Mr. Cohen had a history of lying and would likely lie again, and that Ms. Daniels would use the trial to monetize her story.
And one other issue, more bad news for one of Mr. Trump's biggest supporters, Pete Navarro. What's happened there?
He's a former senior aide to Donald Trump, and he's just lost an appeal to the Supreme Court to delay the prison sentence that he's about to start for refusing to testify before Congress about his involvement in efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election. So he will go to jail. In fact, he's due to check in at a Miami jail by Tuesday afternoon.
Peter Bowes in Los Angeles. Efforts to get aid into Haiti are starting to bear fruit, but on the ground, violence has continued. Armed gangs have shaken the capital with an attack on an affluent area of Port-au-Prince. The political impasse also shows little sign of easing. The Prime Minister, Ariel Henry, announced his resignation a week ago, but a transitional council that will choose his replacement is yet to be appointed. Our correspondent, Will Grant, sent this report from the port city of Cap-Haïtien.
Following a morning killing spree in which the home of a judge was also attacked, at least a dozen bodies were left on the streets of a neighbourhood in Port-au-Prince, and this is supposedly the safe part of town.
The latest violence serves as a reminder, if anyone needed, that Haiti remains closer to anarchy than stability. And that makes it almost impossible for so many here to lead anything that resembles their normal lives amid the chaos.
Just a day old, baby Woodley's first cries are the same of those of children born anywhere, for food and for comfort. But as they get older, the children born in Cap-Haïtien's maternity wing will find such essentials are far from guaranteed in Haiti. Markinson Joseph tells me she would take her newborn boy out of the country altogether if she gets the chance, but she doesn't have the money to flee.
The first room for pathology?
As he shows us around dark and empty wards, Dr. Clairville says the gang's control of the roads is making it impossible to find enough fuel to keep the lights on, let alone to bring in the drugs and equipment they need.
As you can see, we have beds and staff, but often the patients just can't reach us because of their economic situation, or more often than not, their safety.
For some, it has had terrible consequences. Louise Mani was 8.5 months pregnant when she came into hospital. By then, she had dangerously high blood pressure and lost the baby. Preeclampsia is treatable had she been properly monitored or the baby been delivered early. Louise Mani knows her loss was avoidable. The head of UNICEF has called the situation in Haiti horrific and likened the lawlessness to the post-apocalyptic film Mad Max. The security situation aside, the humanitarian need here is critical, and the aid response so far has been painfully slow. The essential things of life are increasingly hard to find. In Port-au-Prince, Vada Oxima and her 9 children have been forced from their home by the violence, and she's struggling to provide the food and water they need. Only God can change this place, she says, because from where I'm sitting, I can't see where any other change is coming from. The gangs have such a grip of Haiti, they are in essence dictating what happens next in this country, who can govern it, who lives in it, and who dies.
Will Grant in Haiti. You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. A warning from President Biden to Benjamin Netanyahu. He said a major Israeli ground operation in Rafah in southern Gaza would be a mistake. Their first call in over a month, which was described as businesslike by the White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Speaking to reporters, he said Israel would send officials to Washington to discuss its Rafah plans.
The president explained why he is so deeply concerned about the prospect of Israel conducting major military operations in Rafah of the kind it conducted in Gaza City and Khan Yunis. First, more than 1 million people have taken refuge in Rafah. They went from Gaza City to Khan Yunis and then to Rafah. They have nowhere else to go.
Israel and the US say 2 high-ranking Hamas commanders have been killed in recent fighting in Gaza. One was the head of operations in its internal security force, Faik Mabho, who died in an Israeli raid on Gaza's largest hospital on Monday morning. Also on Monday, a report by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or IPC, a body of experts responsible for monitoring food security, warned a famine could occur in northern Gaza within 11 weeks. Israel has denied preventing food from getting into Gaza, blaming aid agencies for delays and accusing Hamas of diverting supplies. From Jerusalem, Mark Lowen reports.
Gazans are starving to death. That is the stark and terrifying message from the IPC. UN bodies and aid agencies warn that unless aid pours in and the fighting is halted, Famine will grip northern Gaza by the end of May. Israel has consistently restricted humanitarian deliveries by limiting entry points and performing cumbersome checks. It says Hamas disrupts aid efforts. But criticism of the Israeli government has come from all sides, with the EU accusing it of using starvation as a weapon of war, and the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres calling the report an appalling indictment.
This is the highest number of people facing catastrophic hunger ever recorded by the Integrated Food Security Classification System, anywhere, anytime. This is an entirely man-made disaster, and the report makes clear that it can be halted.
Before dawn, Israeli troops raided Al-Shifa hospital in northern Gaza, which it first attacked in November, accusing it of being a Hamas base. Israeli forces say they killed Hamas's head of internal security, who was armed inside, a worrying sign for Israel of how Hamas has regrouped in the north. An Israeli delegation has landed in Doha for new ceasefire talks, while at the same time Benjamin Netanyahu repeated that he will send the army into Rafah in southern Gaza, where some 1.4 million people are sheltering. Pursuing the war while discussing peace, freeing the hostages while also destroying Hamas. Mr. Netanyahu may well discover he can't have it all.
Mark Lowen. In the past few days, the Houthis in Yemen have again targeted merchant shipping in the Red Sea. The flow of trade has been seriously disrupted by the drone and missile attacks, which began soon after Israel's assault on Gaza. The US and Britain have sent warships, but the Houthis are undeterred. The American fleet is being led by an aircraft carrier, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, which has been carrying out strikes on Houthi targets for more than 4 months. Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale has been on board.
The tempo of jet sorties on the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower has been unrelenting. Operating in the Red Sea, trying to protect merchant ships and themselves from Houthi attacks. We're the first British media on board, witnessing F-18s take off and land almost every minute.
This is probably the most flying I've done on a deployment.
It's the most intense so far.
Oh yes, absolutely. Every day we're flying a ton.
The firm belief on board is that the Houthis have not been acting alone. Rear Admiral Mark Miguez is the carrier strike group commander.
We know Iran is in some way backing the Houthis. They're doing it via intelligence support, providing targeting. They're also providing resupply of weapons, and they're providing them expertise as well.
Well, you're going after the wrong people then. You shouldn't be going after Iraq.
Well, that's a policy decision, but the root of this does start with Iran.
The question is, how long can the US maintain this military presence? Even the Ike's captain, Chris Hill, acknowledges it'll take more than a US carrier strike group to resolve this crisis.
It's difficult to define winning and losing in this kind of conflict. Our goal is to restore freedom of navigation. That's all. I mean, that's a whole of government approach. It's an international approach.
But does that mean stopping every Houthi attack?
That's ideally what we want to get to.
And is that achievable?
Hard to say.
There's no doubt their presence has stopped some attacks and saved the lives of merchant sailors. But not all. And these remain extremely dangerous waters.
Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale. NVIDIA, the American software giant, says that it's developed super chips that will power artificial intelligence to become the new industrial revolution. The company's boss, Jensen Huang, told a developers conference that the Blackwell B200 was made up of, wait for it, 208 billion transistors, more than double the 80 billion on the company's previous chip. It's also 4 times as fast. Our North America business correspondent Erin Delmore reports.
NVIDIA unveiled its new graphics processing unit at a developers conference in California on Monday. It's called the Blackwell, and it's meant to build on the successes of the company's existing GPUs, which are in demand all over the world. NVIDIA makes powerful chips that are used to develop AI technology, and the Blackwell is expected to allow more advanced AI models to be built. It's also expected to be a boon for the tech company, which has ridden AI enthusiasm to the top of the markets. At NVIDIA's Developers Conference in California Monday, the company's CEO Jensen Huang called generative AI the defining technology of our time.
A new way of doing software has emerged, generative AI, which is going to create new infrastructure, a new industrial revolution. The computer of this revolution, the computer of this generation, generative AI, trillion parameters, Blackwell, insane amounts of computing.
Some of the biggest names in tech are expected to use Blackwell GPUs, and we expect to see the technology in action later this year.
Erin Delmore. For the West, the election in Russia, which gave Vladimir Putin a fifth term as president, was a rigged vote. But at a rally in Red Square, he told his supporters that his victory would only make us stronger. They'd gathered there to mark the 10th anniversary of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg sent this report.
After the landslide came the love. Vladimir Putin, portrayed by the Kremlin as a national hero, at a concert marking 10 years since Russia annexed Crimea. Long live Russia, he cried. Cue the national anthem. And some Kremlin choreography to make it look as if Putin is Russia and Russia is Putin. Earlier, we saw the crowds pouring towards Red Square. Thousands of Russians had been given free tickets for the Putin event. After all, the president, who claims to have won 87% of the vote, needs a decent audience.
Western leaders have dismissed Russia's presidential vote as neither free nor fair, a stage-managed election. But the Kremlin couldn't care less what the West thinks. It paints a picture of a president who enjoys the overwhelming support of his people.
Down at the Russian Election Commission, they counted all the votes and they presented all their figures. So, it's 6 more years of President Putin. And yet, the direction of travel for Russia under Vladimir Putin is already clear. More confrontation abroad and repression at home. Few here seem to believe that this election will bring a significant change. If it's the same president, Katya says, then I don't think anything will be different. In a country that's been ruled by the same man for a quarter of a century, Russians are starting to forget what change looks like.
Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. Voting in the Russian presidential election was held in the occupied regions of Ukraine that President Putin claims to have annexed during the war. From Ukraine, here's our Eastern Europe correspondent, Sarah Rainsford.
Ukrainians always refer to the Russian elections in quote marks as the so-called elections. They always knew, of course, that Vladimir Putin was staying in the Kremlin, and what that means is very clear for here in Ukraine. It means more missile strikes, it means more drones, it means more darkness like this when the curfew falls at night in towns like this, Sumy up in the north. You know, in Moscow, for years, the Kremlin has been building up this idea that Putin is Russia. But I think for Ukraine, Putin is Bucha, he's Mariupol, he's Bakhmut, he's all those names that are synonymous with suffering. I think, you know, this invasion of Ukraine has become the defining feature of Vladimir Putin's presidency, and it is still going on. So we're up here in Sumy in the north of the country, and there's been intense shelling on the border in recent days. There are people evacuating their homes. They have no idea when or even whether they're going to be going back there. We've also been talking to people who've been fleeing from occupied areas of eastern Ukraine, those people who don't want to live in Russia to be part of a country that has invaded their country. You know, nothing here in Ukraine has been normal now for more than 2 years since Vladimir Putin launched that full-scale invasion. And now Ukraine is facing another 6 years, at least, of Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. They are celebrating that on Red Square, but here in Ukraine, it means nothing good at all.
Sarah Rainsford. With the latest sports news, here's Andy Barwell.
Thank you very much. Well, the former Premier League goalkeeper Shay Gibbons says the season shouldn't be decided by events off the pitch and in the law courts over breaches of financial fair play rules. Well, after Everton were handed a 10-point deduction earlier this season, reduced to 6 on appeal, and they could face further sanctions, Nottingham Forest have now been deducted 4 points. So when the Premier League resumes after the international break, Forest will have to get themselves out of the drop zone. And this is Gibbons' take on the matter.
We're sitting here now with whatever, a couple of months to go, and it's like, yeah, they could get relegated, they could stay up on an appeal, they could, you're talking about sort of lawyers deciding near enough football matches or appeals, and you know, it's nonsense. I think, for example, Everton was the earlier part of the season, they got done 10 points. My understanding would be they've got the rest of the season to fight that, and by the end of the season they'd be done and dusted, and whatever they agree, 6 points or 7 points or whatever. But then that goes into play the start of next season, so Everton will start next season on -6 points.
After a fan-led review, the Football Governance Bill will be introduced to the UK Parliament today. A new independent regulator for the game will be scheduled, and they'll have the power to settle the ongoing row over financial distribution between the Premier League and the English Football League. In tennis, the two-time Grand Slam champion Simona Halep will face Paula Badosa on the opening day of the Miami Open, as Halep makes her return to the sport following the reduction in length of her doping ban. A group of senior players on the PGA Tour have been meeting with officials from the Saudi Arabia Public Investment Fund, which bankrolls the breakaway Live Golf Series. Motor talks have been taking place between the parties to try and end the rift in the sport that has lasted for the past 2 years. And in cricket, England's women defeated New Zealand by 27 runs in the opening T20 International in Dunedin. England 160 for 4, skipper Heather Knight top scored with 63, and despite an innings of 65 from the opener Susie Bates, well, New Zealand could only muster 133 for 5 from their 20 overs. There is still another 4 T20s to go for the two teams, as well as 3 one-day internationals.
Andy, thank you. Andy Barwell. Where would the Wizard of Oz be without Dorothy's pair of magic ruby red slippers? One of the last surviving pairs worn by Judy Garland in the classic film is going on a world tour before being auctioned off later this year. The newsroom's Ella Bicknell reports.
Off to see the world. As one of the most recognisable pieces of movie memorabilia, these sparkling shoes will be displayed in New York, London, then Tokyo, before they're auctioned off in December. But just like Dorothy, they've had quite the adventure already. In 2005, when they were stolen from a museum in Judy Garland's hometown in the US state of Minnesota. 13 years later, they were recovered in an FBI sting operation. Now their owner, the former actor turned collector Michael Shaw, has put them up for sale with an estimated value of around $3.5 million.
And think to yourself, there's no place like home. There's no place like home.
The ruby slippers were at the heart of the famous 1939 Technicolor musical. In them, Dorothy dances around the yellow brick road, meets her companions Scarecrow, Tin Man and Lion, and by clicking her heels 3 times and saying there's no place like home, they magically transport her back to Kansas. They've become a symbol of the glittering glamour of Hollywood.
With that report. The main news this hour: Japan has raised the cost of borrowing for the first time in 17 years, ending the country's policy of negative interest rates. And a Venezuelan opposition leader says millions more will flee her country if President Nicolas Maduro is re-elected in July. Plenty more, as always, in the Global News podcast, which is made by the same team. Thanks for listening.
This is the BBC World Service, asking if psychedelic drugs could help in the treatment of mental health conditions.
This is very common for people to stop me and say, wait a minute,
You're the mushroom person.
Heidi helps run a clinic in Oregon where the use of psilocybin, the active ingredient in so-called magic mushrooms, is legal in therapeutic sessions.
There's a lot of people suffering now without really effective treatments. So there's a major need.
We'll be hearing about the benefits, but also the concerns that widening access to these drugs could have.
Psilocybin in America is what's called a Schedule 1 substance, the most highly restricted category of illegal drugs.
It's my job to keep people safe and keep people calm. It is very important that people do this with guides and do this in a safe place.
Magic mushrooms and mental health. Today at 8:15 GMT.
Did you know that being a bad tennis player can make you a better writer? In the studio on the BBC World Service has been speaking to Colm Tóibín, one of the world's most celebrated contemporary authors. We'll be exploring Colm's creative process, including learning how he finds inspiration as he walks down the street. And Colm takes me through the creation of his debut poetry collection, Vinegar Hill. That's in the studio with me, Helen Cullen, after the news on the BBC World Service.
BBC News with Neil Nunes. Japan's central bank has ended its policy of negative interest rates and raised the cost of borrowing for the first time in 17 years. It brings to an end a huge stimulus program that had been introduced in 2016. The Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado has warned that Latin America should prepare for a huge wave of mass migration if President Nicolás Maduro is re-elected in July. A fifth of the population are believed to have already left Venezuela for economic reasons. Donald Trump has reacted angrily to his failure to secure a bond of close to $500 million, which he needs to appeal against a judgment in his civil fraud case in New York. He claimed he was being persecuted for seeking to return to the White House. President Biden has again warned the Israeli Prime Minister that a military operation in Rafah in southern Gaza would be a mistake. Benjamin Netanyahu is dispatching a delegation to Washington to explain his plans to avoid excessive civilian casualties. International efforts to get aid into Haiti have been boosted by the opening of a new air bridge with neighboring Dominican Republic. The UN said the first helicopter flights had now begun. The U.S. military says it destroyed 7 anti-ship missiles, 3 drones and 3 weapon storage containers in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen on Monday. It said the weapons presented an imminent threat. The UN Secretary General has expressed concern over the deteriorating security situation in Myanmar. A spokesman said Antonio Guterres was alarmed by reports of recent airstrikes on villages in Rakhine State. And flooding and landslides in Papua New Guinea have left at least 20 people dead. Homes have been damaged and roads washed away in the Central Highlands region. BBC News.
It's become fashionable to talk about fiction as storytelling. And I worry about this, especially if someone says to me, all you Irish are marvellous storytellers. And you think, I don't think that's true because there was so much silence at home.
This is In the Studio, the series that takes you inside the process of fascinating creative minds from around the globe. I'm Helen Cullen, and for this edition I spent time with Colm Tóibín, one of the world's most celebrated contemporary authors.
Someone could say that, well, what are you if you're not a storyteller? And then you could say, well, I'm a literary novelist. But that sounds awful. That sounds really pretentious. That sounds ridiculous. I'm a literary novelist. And so, no matter what you do, you're stuck with this idea that at the basis of our humanity is the idea that people tell stories. I suppose I'm implicated in this despite my effort not to be a storyteller, because I'm thinking storyteller sounds loose, it sounds unstructured, it sounds tedious. And I'm desperately trying not to be tedious.
Originally from Enniscorthy in County Wexford, Ireland, Colm published his first novel, The South, in 1990 after initially embarking on a career as a journalist. Since then he has been nominated 4 times for the prestigious Booker Prize, amongst dozens of other global literary prizes. He has written a total of 12 books of fiction, 3 non-fiction books, 3 collections of essays, an opera libretto, plays, poetry, and perhaps thousands of articles. Among these achievements is Column's 2009 novel Brooklyn. It is the story of a young emigre from his hometown that was also adapted into an Oscar-nominated film starring Saoirse Ronan.
Dear Rose,
And in his most recent work, The Magician, he captures the essence of Thomas Mann. I am just one of countless Irish authors who have been inspired by Column's work and his work ethic. He has recently won the prestigious Rathbones Folio Prize for The Magician, and this spring he is publishing his debut poetry collection, Vinegar Hill. We spoke as Colum was delivering his semester of teaching at Columbia University in New York City. He is an international writer in the truest sense, splitting his time between Dublin, New York and Los Angeles, and his subjects range across the world too. But is the roving lifestyle a problem when it comes to settling down to write?
I can work anywhere. So the idea that there's a sort of mystical room that you could go into, which is, you know, fundamentally yours in some funny way, doesn't exist for me. If you gave me any corner, if you put me in a railway station and just gave me a corner, even with the noise around, I could just get on with what I'm doing. All you need really is the day to yourself. And once you